Why don't we go ahead and get started? So it is a real pleasure for me to welcome Greg Reardon here today to speak to us about his research. So Greg is a late stage doctoral candidate at University of California, Santa Barbara. He works in the Retouch Lab, led by Professor Jan Bassel. He has an interesting background. Did his undergraduate studies at Brown in, what was it, math and economics?
Yeah.
Math and economics. Wow. And then,
Yeah.
went on and did a master's in music technology at NYU. And I think Jan had a similar kind of background in the arts and music before seeing the light and joining the field of haptics. And so for the past, I think, 5 years, you've been there working with Jan at Santa Barbara and doing some really fascinating research that he's going to share with us here today. Along the line, picking up a number of honors, including a couple of Best Paper Awards, one at the IEEE Haptic Symposium in 2020, and then just this year, I was the awards chair. I remember giving that award at the World Haptics Conference, and a number of others as well. So really fascinating research, and I'm going to hand it over to Greg to share it with us.
Hi, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Ed. I'm very excited to be here today to be presenting my research entitled Wave-Mediated Haptics, Leveraging Wave Transport for Dynamic Tactile Feedback. I want to premise this by saying this is my first invited talk, and hopefully not my last, depending on how this goes. So I'm a bit nervous, and at the end when we're doing questions, I'll strictly be accepting easy questions. So keep that in mind. But in truth, I like when these talks are interactive. So if you have any questions or thoughts during the talk, please feel free to speak up, and we can just kind of go back and forth. So I don't think Ed necessarily mentioned what my PhD is in, but the department I'm actually in is called Media Arts and Technology. And a big part of media technology is the reproduction of digital content. And currently we have these general purpose vision and audition displays, such as phones, televisions, computer monitors, loudspeakers, and headphones that allow people to share, transmit, and reproduce digital content basically anywhere in the world. However, there's no equivalent, there's no haptic equivalent for these devices for reproducing digital touch content. And a large part of the reason why there's no sort of unified framework or devices for reproducing digital touch content is due to the complexity of touch sensing. So the sense of touch is mediated by thousands of receptors that are embedded in the skin. And contacts with the skin produce mechanical deformations that are transmitted to these cutaneous mechanoreceptors, which all cooperate to extract information from the mechanical deformation. And if we take a look at the capabilities of the human sensing system as a whole, we can identify a number of properties. And then we can see how they would translate into engineering requirements for some form of a general purpose haptic display. And I want to clarify that these requirements that I'm stating here just represent one feasible or reasonable set of requirements that one might design based on the capabilities of the sensing system. So first, sensing is distributed. And so if we wanted to make a general purpose display, we'd probably say that we want to be able to accommodate an entire hand. Second, due to the densities of receptors in the skin, we have high spatial acuity. So we can sense variations in the location of applied stimuli at very fine resolution on the order of millimeters. And so if we wanted to have a haptic display, we want to be able to produce localized deformations and apply those to the skin at, say, maybe I put 0.5, I was supposed to say 5 millimeter resolution, 0.5, that's very, very fine, but 5 millimeter resolution. And then third, we have high temporal acuity. And so the skin actually extracts information over a broad bandwidth of frequencies ranging from around 0 hertz to 1,000 hertz. So static content all the way up to dynamic forces of around 1,000 hertz. And so we had this general purpose display, we would need it to be wide bandwidth. And I'll just put a range here. Perhaps we want this display to be able to stimulate the skin between 50 and 500 hertz. And so these design requirements are challenging to meet even for state-of-the-art haptic displays. And so there are a number of emerging actuation methods for constructing these high-resolution displays ranging from electrostatic, electromagnetic, pneumatic, magnetoradiologic. There's just a ton of these new emerging actuation methods. And they've actually succeeded in making high resolution displays that are thin, flexible, wearable, and have even miniaturized driving system and actuation requirements. However, it's proven challenging to scale these methods to these large area displays due to a wide variety of concerns that tend to be idiosyncratic to the specific actuation method that you're using. So those challenges might range from like robustness, cost, and complexity. You encounter sort of fundamental mechanical, thermal, and electrical constraints. And also there's some control and addressability issues if you have these large arrays of independent actuators. And so how do we get to the haptic equivalent of a 4K television? So the primary method still employed to design these high resolution haptic displays is based on the idea that the number of actuating elements should be equivalent to the number of display pixels. So one actuator to one display pixel. And in many cases, the actuators are literally the display pixels that you're interacting with. However, my approach to solving this problem is instead to separate the actuation from the display medium. So the actuators would instead transport energy to our display medium. And so you'd have actuators that are strictly less than the number of display pixels on your display. And so we can formalize my proposed approach as consisting of two steps. So we can write the forward transport equations from our actuators to our display pixels as some operator L, which acts on Y, which is the haptic scene that's being displayed on our display. And that's going to be equal to the sum of the forces applied by our actuators at locations xi, or x prime, sorry. And that operator L is going to characterize the system transport physics. And in this general framing, it's arbitrary. It could be linear, it could be nonlinear, it could be anything you want it to be. And then we can formulate the display of some target space-time haptic scene, y hat, as an inverse problem, and computationally solve for an optimal set of driving signals that you would apply to your actuators in order to approximately reproduce that target scene on the display. And so this is exactly the framework that's been adopted by emerging wave-mediated displays. And so these devices use wave transport to deliver vibration feedback to arbitrary locations on a display medium. And you can control the spatial location and temporal waveform of feedback by solving an inverse problem in order to derive an optimal set of actuator driving signals. And you can do this entirely in software, which makes it extremely powerful. And so with this framework, you can see a path towards reproducing digital haptic content on different haptic displays. So we can transmit these digital space-time haptic scenes, y hat, that we want to reproduce. And then you'd have these wave-mediated devices in the middle that have a device-specific software layer that's going to convert that target haptic scene into an optimal set of driving signals. And then you'll be able to replay that on any display that sort of satisfies some basic set of constraints. And actually, this approach resembles what you would find in the field of audio engineering for multi-channel loudspeaker reproduction, where you might have a 5.1 or a 7.1 surround sound mix that needs to be optimally decoded for a set of loudspeakers in a particular room. And part of what led me to this framework is because I began my research journey in audio, looking at how to reproduce 3D sound over head speakers. I don't know what that is, but headphones and loudspeakers. And so when you have this particular decomposition of the display problem, it emits multiple avenues of research, each of which I've been able to explore in my own work. And so I've constructed computational algorithms to render different types of haptic scenes and patterns using this paradigm. I've also engineered materials to have favorable transport physics for this type of paradigm. And finally, I've also investigated transport phenomena on solid media. And so first I'll discuss computational rendering of haptic scenes. So I've actually designed two different devices to control viscoelastic waves in soft media. So the device on the left was our initial prototype that we made in 2020, which consisted of 16 piezoelectric cantilevers that were embedded in the synthetic polymer medium, which acts as our display. And then on the right, we see our more recent prototype, or not prototype anymore, it's device, published work. It consists of 20 custom electromagnetic actuators that are placed on the periphery of this display medium that excite these tablet embedded magnets. And so these devices are extremely soft, they can be readily deformed and also molded into different form factors for whatever scenario we might encounter. And when we drive these systems with our actuators, they generate these propagating viscoelastic waves, which are then used to deliver spatially and temporally resolved haptic feedback on the display. And so if users contact these viscoelastic wave fields, they feel those patterns as vibration feedback.
Sorry, what is that material?
This material is a humimic gelatin it's a synthetic medical gelatin that's typically used for tissue phantoms.
Okay. And then they have the magnets. Did you say magnets?
Yeah, so you can see a little bit here. So these magnets are embedded inside the display, and we have these peripherally situated coils that then drive those magnets. We use like commodity audio hardware to drive these. So essentially, these are basically speakers that are then driving these magnets into display. Yeah.
Why is the shape of it like that, where it's like kind of like different towards side and like straight over here?
So the specific reason has to do with trying to minimize certain types of vibration modes that you would get due to symmetries in a plate. So this is a stadium design. If you're familiar with ergodic systems, this is basically a chaotic system, so things don't bounce into the same location as they move around. So in order to manipulate these viscoelastic wave fronts, we first need to understand how to the forward transport in the display. So for this viscoelastic wave system, forward transport can be written in terms of a linear viscoelastic wave operator L, which acts on our wave field, which is equal to the sum of the forces applied by our actuators in the system. And so we can write the wave field solution in terms of Green's functions or actuator impulse responses, where the Green's function G is the response to the medium at location X at all times T to a unit impulsive force applied by actuator I at time capital T. And I've dropped some notation from the Green's function just to make it look simpler. And so this is a system impulse response. And so with these system impulse responses or Green's functions, we can write the wave field solution y x of t as a summation over all of our actuators and a convolution between the driving signals and the Green's functions from the actuators to the display location. And so in practice, we physically measure the surface wave field on our display and these Green's functions on a fine grid using scanning laser Doppler vibrometry, which is an optical method for measuring the velocity of a surface. And so when we apply driving signals to this system, we get this complex viscoelastic surface wave field. And here's a video of the measured surface wave field. So this is experimental data during what I call scanning wavelet synthesis. The algorithm is based on just delaying these actuator driving signals with a very simple algorithm. And in order to move energy from one side of the display to the other side of the display at some specified speed. And as a quick side note, we've perceptually evaluated these whole hand generative patterns and found them to produce a wide range of expressive sensations. And so in a behavioral experiment in which subjects felt these patterns and then provided semantic descriptors of the sensation, this particular stimulus felt like something was scanning or sweeping across participants' hands. And when we increased this scanning speed from one side to the other, participants felt like the display had a heartbeat. Yeah.
What direction are the waves? That's a graphic display, but are the waves in the plane of the?
Yeah, so this is only normal oscillations.
Oh, this is normal.
This is only normal direction.
Mhm.
Yep. So yeah, so the laser Doppler vibrometry
Oh, it's
system
laser.
is normal to the system. Yeah.
And they're coming from those because of this, like
Because the peripherally situated actuator. So you see the device up here. So we're driving them in the periphery. And in this case, this is just a simple delay algorithm to just move energy from one side to the other.
Could you say just a bit more about that? Because I'm a little confused as to what the excitation is.
Yeah, so the excitation signal is specifically about like 20 or 30 millisecond sinusoid signals that are being driven by each actuator. And then there's a applied delay. So the actuators over here are being delayed for far more than that one. And there's a little bit of like projection onto this axis so that I can actually control the speed at which the scanning sensation would move across the hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
So nothing about what we're seeing here is propagation of waves. It's all because of the phasing, the turning on or turning off various actuators.
Well, I mean, we're looking at the wave propagation on the surface of the
But
display.
it's not like there's a wave speed in this direction. That's not relevant.
No, not in this case. Yeah, this is just, this is a simple, description of what the forward transport kind of looks like. So, you apply energy and you get these wave fronts that are generated. I'll go into more computational objectives in a second. Suppose that our goal is to focus these viscoelastic wave fields to a singular location on the display in order to construct a tactile pixel at that location. And so recall again that forward transport equation is given by a convolution between the actuator driving signals and our Green's functions in the display. And we can state a computational objective more formally, which is to derive driving signals Fi such that vibrations U of t are going to be delivered at a specific location and time, in this case at x0. So it looks like this, you have these propagating waves which would converge onto this location at x0 and actually deliver that signal U of t at that location. And so one potential alternative interpretation of this, of constructing a tactile pixel, is that it functions as a virtual actuator, which I can place anywhere on my display that's being driven with signal U of t. And so to accomplish this, we apply driving signals based on time reversal focusing. And this time reversal focusing solution is computed by first experimentally measuring the Green's functions from each actuator on the display to the pixel location at x0. And then the driving signal is derived through convolution between that Green's function and the tactile pixel signal that you want to deliver to that location. And if we plug F into our wave field solution, we see that the expression yields in terms of cross correlation functions between the Green's functions on the display and the measured Green's function at the pixel location x0. And then if we plug in x0 into this equation, this actually simplifies into an approximate delta function that's involved with our tactile pixel signal at x0. So the key point here is that U of t is going to be displayed at x0 beginning at time capital T. Yeah.
Are the actuators like bidirectional? So like obviously they can put out some sort of signal into this gel stuff, but if I like flick the center of the gel, would it be able to feel the wave that propagates out from where I flicked it back into the system?
So in this case, we're not doing any sensing. It's purely actuation on this side. I'm actually, just because our time got a little crunch, I'm actually going to try to avoid some of the questions. So maybe at the end, if we have time, we can go into specific questions. So let's take a look at some experimental results to see what this actually looks like in practice. So this is a video of the wave field on the display surface, which we measured once again using scanner waves of Doppler vibrometry. And this is while we're rendering a single tactile pixel at the location in the center of the display. And so you can see that waves are generated from the periphery by those electromagnets. And then because of the driving signals that we sent into it, waves are going to converge onto that location, basically and to constructively interfere. And so ideally, if users touch the display at that location, they'll feel that excited tactile pixel. And so in a couple of our works, we ran behavioral studies on these wave fields to see how these excited tactile pixels were perceived. And so participants were asked to identify the location of the excited tactile pixel. And in the first experiment on our earlier prototype, participants placed both their index fingers on the display, and we excited either the left pixel, the right pixel, or both of them simultaneously. So we had these two tasks, a left-right task, and a left-right both, where both meant that both pixels were excited simultaneously. We had extremely high accuracy, so it was quite easy to tell which of these pixels was excited, as we would expect from our wave field results. And then in a follow-up study on our new device, we actually placed participants' whole hand on the display and determined whether or not we could stimulate individual tactile pixels at different regions on the hand. And also in that case, we had very, very high accuracies, above 90% or 89% for all locations. And so these localized tactile pixels were accurately perceived and interpreted with actually zero training whatsoever by participants, and no instructions on how they should be contacting the display, only where they should be placing their hand or their finger. So we then explored how we could render these more complicated patterns on these displays using these single tactile pixels as primitives. So on the left, we have these stationary tactile pixels, which users can perceive as localized vibrations on the display. We could have them anywhere on the display, and we could have multiple of them at one time. And so we wanted to see if we could move these vibration sources dynamically along some arbitrary trajectory. And this level of wave field control might open up a number of doors to have haptic feedback co-located with video content on a screen. And we might be able to render objects, motion, and shapes on these displays just by controlling these wave fields remotely. And so suppose that we want to render a tactile pixel that moves along a specified path P of t and emits the signal U of t while it's moving along that path. So the thing we want to reproduce is the given by this video. And so the actuator driving signal is required to produce this moving tactile pixel. It's described by this integral expression on the right of the screen, which is composed of the source emission along the path, U of t, and an ensemble of time reverse Green's functions from along that path. In practice, it's challenging to compute this integral, even in discrete time, because there'd be many Green's functions from along this path. And so it's not practical for us to actually try to solve this integral. And so we introduced a discrete path approximation, and in which case we sample our source path P of t at regular intervals, which yields a discrete path P of m, which you can see on the bottom of the screen. And actually, this approximation is quite powerful because it allows us to exploit high correlations between adjacent Green's functions. So these Green's functions in the display, if they're very close to one another, they're going to be quite similar. And so we can exploit that correlation in order to approximate the moving source signal U of t as a discrete set of emissions at each of those sampled locations. And so after redefining our source signal U of t to be these discrete emissions, and with our approximation, we actually can derive the driving signal solution as a sum of convolutions between the time reverse Green's functions at those sampled path locations and the individual discrete emissions at each of those respective locations. And so the reproduced source motion would look something like this. And so the video in the middle of the slide shows the time-varying wave field oscillations when rendering a circular source motion path that's moving at 8 centimeters per second with a 5 millimeter sampling distance. And so energy is delivered from the periphery of the device by the actuators and then converges onto the sampled path locations. And before the energy is completely decayed, energy is already being sent to focus onto the next location in the sampled path. And on the right, you can see what the time average measurements look like. And so we tested this motion algorithm on larger and more complex trajectories, which trace the entirety of the screen. We traced letters and emojis, and I couldn't help myself from drawing the letters UC for University of California, just a little shout out to my university. And in all cases that we tested, we found that the wave fields accurately match the program source motion. And we also found that at any given focusing frame, the size of that tactile pixel that we were focusing was on average 0.8 centimeters. So it's less than a centimeter, it's quite small. And so these are very localized sources of energy on the display. And so as this actually constitutes an effective display resolution of around 25 by 15 haptic pixels on the display, which is about 20 times higher resolution than the number of actuated degrees of freedom that we're employing here. And so just in order to assess how this motion algorithm was perceived, we conducted a behavioral experiment in which participants identified the direction of a linear source on the display as moving either leftward or rightward across their fingertips. They're also briefly asked to describe the sensations that they felt. And we tested 4 different motion speeds ranging from 4 centimeters a second all the way up to 50 centimeters a second. And for reference, the 50 centimeters per second stimulus traversed the display in about 250 milliseconds. These are very rapid stimulation across the fingertips. And our 9 participants identified the correct motion direction in 99% of all experimental trials, and described the sensation as like a pleasant brush across their fingertips, and as if something was kind of moving underneath their fingers on the display. So we got some pretty interesting responses from participants. And so in this first section, I described a number of different computational algorithms that allow me to control these viscoelastic waves, and also showed how these algorithms allowed us to generate a number of novel haptic patterns and effects on these surface displays. And one important factor that affects display performance, and probably the most important factor, arises from the materials that you're using in the system. And that actually determine the wave transport physics. And I'll explain this in the next section of my talk. So I feel like I blistered through that middle section there just to get us back on time. We can pause here for a sec to take questions. I think I'm okay on time for right now for the end of it. Yeah, please.
Does the presence of a hand, significant, it's much like the material that you're transmitting through.
Yeah.
How much does that affect the transmission?
Yeah, so we haven't measured the effect when we have the hand on the plate. It's a little challenging to fabricate that kind of system. I will say that the experimental results we've gotten give us hope that when you're dealing with fingertip contact, the effect on transmission is quite low. With whole hand, we definitely think there's an effect on transmission. And it's something that we're interested in investigating, but we don't have data to make any
But
claims.
perceptually, it seems to work anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Speed, you talked about, I guess, what was it, 50 something per millimeters or centimeters per second?
Yes.
Which strikes me as quite fast. I would have thought that you could only move the source so quickly due to sort of what's the right term, to resonance time for the waves to die down.
So there is a refresh time on the display. However, when if you space the points that you're sampling at further away, in infinity, if you increase that speed to infinity, you're just focusing energy to 6 points simultaneously. So if you think about it like that, if you have the control degrees of freedom to do that, there's not really a problem. So the further you space those points, the more rapidly you can scan these sources across the display, because those Green's function correlations are actually lower.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, thanks.
yeah, please.
So I'm assuming that you use a polymer instead of a rigid board because the weight speed is slower in the polymer as compared to the rigid board, right? Is that ever like a problem for you when there's so much tapping within the polymer system?
You've led me right to the next part of my talk. Thank you very much. Is there any other
I
questions?
want to follow up on Ed's question. Word it a little bit differently. So if I want to use that for real-time feedback as opposed to a pre-planned, brush across your fingers, I would think that the die-down time of the waves would impact, like, I assume you're playing over the whole trajectory, like over the whole 1 second motion of the stimulus. You plan that out in advance and then you play it. So now if you're generating it as you go and you want this thing to move around, when you were making that path go around, you probably planned that all out in advance, right?
Yeah.
And so you took into account the time that it takes for waves to dissipate, et cetera.
Yeah.
So if you're doing this in real time, I imagine there's some responsiveness issues in the same way that if I'm controlling a robot that's connected to soft stuff, I wouldn't expect the same kind of, bandwidth of position control that I might.
Yeah, you're exactly right. But in this case, it's actually not the die down time. It's how long it takes to coalesce that energy to a single point. So, these impulse responses that we measured in this display are, most of the energy is there for about, 30 milliseconds. So what we're talking about is about definitely less than 50 milliseconds latency. So if you touch the display within 50 milliseconds, I could generate that energy to stimulate your skin. So it's really about how long the decay time is of the impulse response in the system, and also how long you want to coalesce energy for. So if you have a very resonant system, like in this room, the decay time is a second. So you could coalesce energy for a second to focus energy to a point, but you could also cut it back the amount of time that you're coalescing energy for. So you can imagine that you might only want to coalesce energy for 20 milliseconds if you needed the stimulation to happen very rapidly.
But you're saying if you wanted to say display at this location in this room, it's going to take you a second to be able to do it.
If you wanted to amass as much energy as possible. So that decay there, maybe I'll keep moving so I don't get derailed here. I think I probably went into too much detail, but essentially the reverb time of the impulse response is going to dictate how long you can feasibly coalesce energy for. And so if you have a very long decay time, you could coalesce energy for much longer time scale, but you may not want to. So that's like the maximum time that you could coalesce energy for.
One real quick one. For haptic perceivability, are you modulating this at a particular frequency?
So in this case, the time reversal focusing solutions mean that you have this, they bias themselves towards the frequencies that propagate most effectively in the polymer, which is around 200 hertz in this circumstance. I'll move on and there'll be some other stuff addressed in the next section. So during the course of my work with these devices, it became clear that the underlying physics had a big quality on the feedback that we could produce. So our new device was made modular so we could replace these the polymer materials and also modify the support structures to see how that affected our wave transport physics. The medium that we use in this display is the synthetic polymer gel, and it's primarily used for medical tissue phantoms. It's extremely soft, and so it has a slow wave speed. And this slow wave speed is very critical because as you have the lower the wave speed, the smaller the spatial wavelengths on the display, and that's ultimately going to determine the spatial resolution of our control over the wavefronts. So if you have very, very fine wavelengths, you could amass energy to a very, very small point.
What is the speed?
5 meters per second. And so these polymers also are also very lossy, right? So the dynamic loss in these viscoelastic solids is typically characterized by the loss tangent, which is the shear loss modulus divided by the shear storage modulus, G double prime over G prime. And a higher loss implies that waves tend to attenuate rapidly. So it's challenging to deliver broad bandwidth signals over long distances in these polymers. And so that degrades focusing and implies that you need more actuated degrees of freedom in the display. And so to improve my devices, I went in search of material with low wave speed and low damping. And although I'm not a materials researcher, I ended up doing a lot of rheometry experiments in order to characterize the loss tangents of common polymers in order to select an optimal material. And after doing that, we found out that the loss tangents tend to vary very little for these common polymers. And if anyone knows one that has low loss, you let me know after the talk. But so I decided to go about this problem from a different perspective and to take a more rigid material, something like plastic, that has a intrinsically low loss, and then try to slow down the wave speed on the display. So prior research has shown that one method to overcome the intrinsic properties of a material is to fabricate a metamaterial. And so by attaching resonant structures in a periodic fashion to a thin plate, researchers showed that within some limited bandwidth, they were able to slow down the wave speed on their plate by basically by about half. And so the plot on the bottom of the screen shows the time varying wave field at one specific time frame. And you can see that inside the metamaterial patch, the spatial variations are about half of what you'd find outside of it. And so the relation between wave speed and wavelength is given by the dispersion relation, which states that the wavelength C is equal to the frequency divided by the wave number. And of course, the wave number is the reciprocal of wavelength. So lower wave speed C, you get a lower wavelength on the display. And so our idea was to engineer a slow wave speed dispersion branch such that the wave speed in the metamaterial plate was much lower than the wave speed in the unmodified plate for some specified bandwidth given by omega 0 to omega 1. And so in order to achieve these engineering requirements, we first numerically simulated a metamaterial plate. And the unit cell is the smallest repeating element on these metamaterial plates, which usually consists, which in our case consists of this thin plate with some attached structure that's to be determined. And so in simulation, we apply a periodic flow K boundary condition on the unit cell with spatial periodicity that's given by Kx and Ky, which are the wave numbers that you're applying and impinging on the plate from the X and Y direction respectively. And so the harmonic motion on this unit cell in generalized coordinates can be expressed in terms of a stiffness and a mass matrix and generalized displacements and forces. And after applying Bloch's theorem, this equation can be simplified into an eigenvalue problem with a reduced degree of freedom, mass, and stiffness matrix, K prime, M prime, with spatial periodicity, with them being functions of the spatial periodicity of that flow K condition. So they're parameterized by Kx, Ky. And so by selecting specific Kx and Ky, we can solve the eigenvalue problem to back out omega. And so we have Kx, Ky, and omega. We can estimate our wave speed C in simulation for this particular unit cell structure if it was repeated infinitely. And so we're allowed to, in simulation, we can use this unit cell description in order to, determine what the wave speed is for specific plates and attached structures in order to satisfy our engineering requirement. And so this design process yielded a unit cell design, which consisted of a thin acrylic plate with an attached brass rod of approximately 30 millimeters, which we then fabricated on this acrylic plate that was 25 centimeters by 15 centimeters. This was done by simple laser cutting and then press fitting these brass rods into the laser cut holes. And then our new metamaterial plate has over 300 unit cells on it. And so after fabricating the plate, we measured the wave speed as a function of frequency and compared our results to our simulations and to the wave speed on the unmodified plate. And what we found was that the metamaterial plate exhibited a 4 times lower wave speed than the unmodified plate. So at 300 hertz, if you're dealing with a regular plate, regular acrylic plate of this thickness, you see that the wave speed is about 40 meters per second. Whereas in our metamaterial plate, it's about 10 meters per second.
Sorry, what is the material on top of brass rods?
This is acrylic.
Is one solid piece of acrylic or?
Oh, so the rods are hanging down in this view. You showed us view with your rods.
I did, yeah, sorry. So this
You can
is the
see
top
there.
surface of the display with these periodic resonators extending downward from the display. So you interact with the top surface. And on the right, you can see a picture of this new device, in which case we only needed 8 electromagnetic actuators because we were able to achieve this low damping, low wave speed regime. And on this new device, instead of using our time, well, actually, what's our time?
12:44.
12:44. Okay, I'm gonna skip through some of this math. We don't need to go through this. So we use optimization-based solutions instead of our time reversal focusing solution. And so the video on the left shows the wave field oscillation on the plate surface when I'm driving it with some least squares regularized minimum norm solution, and I'm focusing to that center point in the display. And what we see is that it resembles the wave field results that we were getting on the soft material. And that's because our wave speed is about 10 meters per second. And if we compare that to the prior polymers, which were about 5 meters per second. And what's nice here is that we have a wider bandwidth because energy is not decaying. We have less actuated degrees of freedom because of that as well. And with these optimization-based solutions, we can actually make these nearly perfect Dirac delta functions on the display. And so energy gets coalesced for about 20 milliseconds, similar to the soft plate, and then rapidly decays. And it's extremely flat in the bandwidth that we designed it to be. And so to summarize my work on these wave-mediated surface displays, I've been able to control the surface wave field to deliver haptic feedback on these devices. And the scale at which we control energy is around 1 centimeter over a large area with very few actuated degrees of freedom. And then further, we saw how we can engineer material displays or display materials to have favorable transport physics in order to improve our capacity to control wave fields on these devices. And so in the last part of my work, it's going to pivot a little bit. I'm going to discuss some work on mid-air holographic displays, which can deliver haptic sensations to the skin in free space. So my work on these wave-mediated displays builds on prior work from emerging holographic haptic displays. So these holographic haptic displays employ phased ultrasound arrays, similar to what you'd find in medical imaging, and acoustic particle levitation and manipulation. And these devices focus ultrasound to specific points in 3D space, and then these points of high acoustic energy apply a nonlinear radiation force to the surface that they're impinging upon. In this case, that would be the skin. And so when these forces are delivered to the skin, they generate sensations that we can feel. So here's a quick video to see what this process looks like. So you see these ultrasound points are actually synced up with some images, but they're applying energy and pushing this liquid in this case. And you can imagine you put your hand there, it's also going to push your hand. And so in practice, these ultrasound foci are rapidly scanned across the skin at speeds ranging from 3 to 20 meters per second in order to improve their perceptibility. And rapidly moving these focal points across the skin allows users to touch, feel, and interact with 3D content in free space. And actually, this technology has been commercialized by Ultraleap. It's attracted investments on the order of $100 million. However, sensations produced by these devices tend to be diffuse and indistinct, and users have described it as feeling that they're touching a piece of thin fabric. And actually, in studies, researchers have found that the perceived focal size of these devices, so the size that you feel it on your skin, is about 3 centimeters, which compared to the acoustic focal resolution in air is about 5 times larger. So the acoustic focal size is about 6 millimeters, and yet you feel like it's about 3 centimeters on your skin. So we hypothesized that wave transport in the skin was actually responsible for this discrepancy. So in a preliminary work, we imaged the skin while it was being stimulated by one of these devices. And so the video on the right shows the wave field on the skin that's produced by these small ultrasound foci when it was swept 11 meters per second across the skin. And actually what we found is that this small ultrasound foci, as you can see, excites widespread oscillations in the skin. We actually did not expect to see, this was surprising to us when we took this data back in 2019. And so to better understand this phenomena that we were seeing in the skin, we simulated the tissue response numerically. And we actually found that the ultrasound focus produces shear shock waves in our simulated tissue. And so because that ultrasound source was being swept faster than the speed of propagation in the medium, waves constructively interfere to form this mock cone. And so as you can see from the results on the side, the second we move from this subsonic regime where the Mach number is less than 1 into the supersonic regime, you start to elicit these widespread oscillations in the skin. And the wave speed values we used in our simulated tissue match those that you find in the skin as well. And so after simulating the response, we confirmed the response using vibrometry measurements that we took on a tissue phantom. So on the left, you can see the response to an ultrasound focus that was scanned at 4 meters per second across our tissue phantom, and then compared to our simulations. So this is the subsonic regime. And then in the supersonic regime, we see that we get these really beautiful shock waves that are forming in these tissue phantoms, which I think is just really, really cool. Yeah, and in both cases, our measurements matched our simulations quite well. And so finally, we analyzed the in vivo response in the skin. But given the complexity and heterogeneity of the skin and tissue, the measured wave fields were far more complex than what you would find on these like idealized tissue phantoms. But nonetheless, we saw a clear change in the spatial extent of these ultrasound elicited vibrations. And we found that at high scanning speeds, you would get these waves that spread up to 10 centimeters away from the ultrasound focus, where at slow speeds, those waves tended to be confined to closer to the focus at around 4 to 5 centimeters. And when we ran a behavioral study in which participants were tasked with identifying the direction of this scanned ultrasound source, we found a clear inverse correlation between the spatial extent of those vibrations and perceptual acuity. And so for these holographic haptic displays, their capabilities are ultimately determined by the biomechanical transmission properties of the skin. And so one key generalizable insight that we can gather from this study is that these induced vibrations in the skin are mediating haptic perception. And we've actually been investigating this question in a more general context to understand the role that tissue biomechanics play in the neural encoding of touch information. And so this plot is from work done by my colleague, Neely Tumala. And in the work, we measured the surface of the skin using optical vibrometry at over 300 points while it was being stimulated by a contacting probe. And then we used those measurements to investigate the biomechanical properties of tissue and then also use those skin oscillations to drive neural simulations. And so we found that due to tissue biomechanics, skin oscillations excited touch receptors across the hand and actually aided in encoding the stimulus information efficiently, which might have implications for perception. And actually this work should be out on bioRxiv next week. So if you're interested in touch information and the encoding of it by neurons, then definitely check it out. It's really cool work. So to return to the topics addressed by my talk, in my research, I've been able to design algorithms to computationally render haptic scenes in these wave-mediated displays. And using these displays, I can display forms of haptic content that have not been able to be reproduced before. And then I've employed state-of-the-art techniques for controlling wave transmission in rigid media by designing a metamaterial plate. And was successful in reducing the wave speed in these plates by more than 4 times. And finally, I've analyzed the transmission of various transport phenomena in the skin, which has implications for haptic rendering on these wave-mediated displays, but it also has general implications for the importance of tissue mechanics in mediating the perception of haptic feedback. And the research I've been able to perform has all been enabled by reframing this display problem. If we recall from the beginning, wave-mediated displays enable computational software-based solutions to rendering and are not constrained by predetermined actuator layouts. And so the inclusion of this software layer is critical, as it is in both audio and video displays, as it allows an arbitrary device to reproduce the same digital content. And so the research I presented here provides a general framework for the standardized reproduction of haptic content. And so hopefully soon we can change this picture, and we can say that we can in fact reproduce digital touch information in the same way that we do visual and auditory information. So we can have digital media that we can see, hear, and touch. And so to conclude, I'd first like to thank the director of the Retouch Lab, Professor Jan Vizel. I'd also like to thank my collaborators at other institutions and my colleagues in the Retouch Lab, particularly those whose work was featured at various points in today's talk. So thank you for your time.
I mean, we have some time for.
12:53, so
Yeah, until.
we need to, if everybody can help clear out the chairs.
All right, so we need
5
to get out
minutes.
of here a couple of minutes before 1, but it gives us about 5 minutes for some Q&A, so. Please, do you have questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I sped through parts of that at the end. I wanted to get through it, and might have been a little rapid, but yeah.
I guess I can start off. I have a question about how the final study you showed us of the shock waves in scan when the source is swept too rapidly. How does that connect back to the work that you've done, where you're also sweeping the source around?
Yeah, actually, so it applies in the same fashion. So in those holographic haptic displays, you have an identical setting to what we have in my displays. You have this array of actuators. You have some transporting medium. In this case, it's fluid, and then you have the skin as the final sort of mediating layer before perception. And we have a very similar thing on my display, except there's a couple of differences. So the first one is that in the holographic haptic displays, you have these nonlinear forces that are being applied to the skin. So you don't have independent frequency control over the kinds of waves that you're eliciting. So because these forces are just applied and you can't control the type of frequency content that you're displaying to the skin, it differs a lot from our circumstance. And I'll wrap that in a sec. And then second, because we have this surface on our display, we actually, because you have this soft or rigid material that's sort of mediating the response, you actually can apply more localized deformation than you would expect, because it's ultimately, you can apply more force through the display to the skin. So you might not need as much, you might not need to excite the skin so rapidly in order to generate a response.
Is that just an impedance match type of issue?
So it's just you can't just. So sorry, that was a little bit of a roundabout way of getting to the point I wanted to get to. The forces that the display can apply. In those circumstances, you sweep the ultrasound focus rapidly because you can't feel it, because they don't deliver a lot of force. And yet in these vibration-based devices that I'm working with, you can feel it very, very easily. I don't necessarily need to sweep energy across the display in order to form these shock fronts in the skin, because I have enough displacement to actually apply to the skin directly.
I see. Okay.
So sorry.
So the air mediated ones are sort of gotten a bit of a catch-22. They need to sweep rapidly to create a sensation you can feel, and yet in doing so, they create these shock fronts that make it very diffuse.
Yes, exactly. So in that subsonic regime, the amplitudes that you get are much lower than in the supersonic regime, because you don't get constructive interference at the focal point.
Got it. Okay.
But yet when you do that, you get energy that spreads everywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay.
Please.
How would you measure the skin's waves? Like, how do you do that?
So we use the same scanning laser Doppler vibrometry method. So in this case, we fix the hand to this vibration isolated table. And then we have this laser Doppler vibrometer that's placed normal to the skin surface. And we measure sequentially at each point while it's being stimulated. So for the ultrasound one, we have it at an angle over here. And then for a normal display, you might just have a contacting probe here. Excuse me, sorry. And we can just measure the skin surface normally.
Any other questions? All right, well, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you all for your time.